The summer of 1897 breathed its last warm sighs across the English countryside. The rolling hills of Derbyshire were painted in hues of amber and gold, the hedgerows heavy with blackberries, and the ancient forests that dotted the landscape rustled with secrets as old as the soil itself. The sky stretched endlessly blue above the Blackwood estate, unmarred by even the faintest wisp of cloud, as if nature herself had conspired to create the perfect day for what was about to unfold. The Blackwood estate had stood for over 3 centuries, its gray stone walls weathered by time and stained with the verdant tendrils of climbing ivy. The main house, a sprawling Victorian manor that had replaced the original Tudor structure after a mysterious fire in 1801, rose from the landscape like a statement of defiance against the natural world that surrounded it. Its windows glinted in the sunlight, watching like unblinking eyes over the generations of Blackwoods who had lived, schemed, and died within its walls. It was on such a day, when summer teetered on the precipice of autumn, that 4 cousins gathered beneath the ancient oak that had witnessed the rise and fall of their family's fortunes for longer than any written record could attest. This was to be their most memorable and final picnic together, though only one of them fully understood the significance of the occasion. The Blackwood family had been prominent in the county for generations. Their fortune, first accumulated through the wool trade in Tudor times, and later expanded through shrewd investments in coal mines and railways, had bought them not only the vast estate, but also considerable political influence. Whispers of how the family had managed to prosper even during times when others faltered had long circulated among the local population. Tales of midnight rituals, strange disappearances, and bargains with forces best left undisturbed. These stories were dismissed by polite society as the superstitious murmurings of uneducated peasants, but even the most rational visitor to the Blackwood estate could not help but feel a certain unease beneath the veneer of Victorian respectability. The 4 cousins who gathered that day were the last of their generation, the end of a bloodline that had once seemed destined to endure forever. Their parents, 2 brothers and their respective wives, had perished together in a railway accident 5 years earlier, leaving the cousins as the sole inheritors of the Blackwood legacy. The family solicitor, Mr. Hargreaves, had remarked with some concern that it was unusual for a family of their standing to have produced so few offspring in the current generation. Most troubling for the continuation of the line, he had murmured while reviewing the estate documents. None of the cousins had yet married, a fact that caused considerable gossip in county society. Eleanor, the youngest at 22, arrived first at the appointed spot beneath the ancient oak tree. Her blonde hair, the color of ripe wheat, was pinned neatly beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat, adorned with silk flowers that matched the pale blue of her eyes. Her white summer dress, with its modest lace collar and cuffs, billowed gently in the breeze, the fabric fine enough to suggest wealth, but not so ostentatious as to appear vulgar. There was a gentleness to Eleanor that belied her sharp mind and observant nature. Of the 4 cousins, she was the one most beloved by the servants and tenants of the estate, known for her visits to sick children and her quiet donations to the parish poor box. She spread a large checkered blanket on the ground, taking care to smooth out every wrinkle, and began unpacking the wicker picnic basket she had brought from the kitchen. From within, she withdrew carefully wrapped packages tied with string, each containing delicacies prepared under her watchful eye: cucumber sandwiches with crusts removed, hard-boiled eggs with a touch of paprika, slices of cold roast beef, fruit tarts with pastry so delicate it seemed to dissolve upon touch, and a selection of cheeses from the Blackwood dairy. She arranged them meticulously on the serving platters she had brought, her movements betraying both the care with which she had planned this gathering and a nervous energy that caused her hands to tremble slightly as she worked. "Always the punctual one, aren't you, Eleanor?" The voice, warm and teasing, belonged to Thomas, 25 and Eleanor's favorite among her cousins. He approached with long, confident strides, his waistcoat unbuttoned in a casual manner that their grandmother would have scolded him for, were she still alive, to enforce the rigid standards of propriety that had governed her household. His chestnut hair was slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck, and his green eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that had often led Eleanor into childhood adventures and occasional trouble. Thomas had always been the most restless of the cousins, chafing against the expectations placed upon him as a Blackwood heir. While William had immersed himself in his scientific pursuits and Margaret had embraced London society, Thomas had spent the past years traveling across Europe, sending home letters filled with tales of alpine climbs, Mediterranean sailing adventures, and encounters with artists, philosophers, and revolutionaries in the great cities of the continent. His return to the estate 2 months ago had been unexpected, attributed to a sudden homesickness that Eleanor suspected had more to do with dwindling funds than sentimental attachment to Derbyshire. In one hand, Thomas carried a bottle of wine, its label suggesting French origin and considerable expense, while in the other he held a leather-bound book whose worn spine indicated frequent reading. "Someone must be," Eleanor replied with a smile that softened her features and brought a dimple to her left cheek. "Otherwise nothing would ever get done, and we should all waste away waiting for the others to arrive. You know how Margaret loses track of time when she's preparing for an appearance. And William," her voice trailed off, a shadow crossing her face at the mention of their eldest cousin. Thomas sat beside her on the blanket, placing the wine bottle carefully within reach. "A Bordeaux from Father's collection," he announced with a conspiratorial wink, "from that locked cabinet in the library that we were expressly forbidden to touch as children. He'll hardly notice it's missing among the dozens of identical bottles." His eyes twinkled with mischief. "And if he does, I shall simply blame it on the servants, as is the time-honored tradition of our class." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, a gesture that managed to convey both disapproval and amusement. "You're terrible, Thomas. Those servants have names and feelings, and some have been with the family since before we were born. That's why you adore me," he replied, unrepentant. "I speak the uncomfortable truths that you're too kind to voice." He winked and leaned back on his elbows, the posture of relaxed privilege, gazing up at the oak's sprawling branches. The ancient tree was said to be over 800 years old, its massive trunk so wide that it would take 3 grown men with arms outstretched to encircle it. Local legend claimed that the oak had been sacred to the Druids who once practiced their mysterious rites in these hills, long before the first Blackwood had claimed the land. "Have you heard from Margaret? Will she actually grace us with her presence today?" Thomas asked, idly leafing through his book. A collection of Byron's poetry, Eleanor noted, appropriate for her romantically inclined cousin. "Or has some duchess's tea party claimed her attention instead?" "She promised she would come," Eleanor said, arranging plates on the blanket. Fine china, not the everyday earthenware that would have sufficed for a less significant occasion. Each plate bore the Blackwood crest, a stylized tree with roots extending deep into the earth, surrounded by an intricate border of what appeared at first glance to be decorative scrollwork, but upon closer inspection revealed itself as ancient symbols whose meaning had been lost to all but a select few. This picnic was special after all, a farewell of sorts, though only Eleanor understood the full significance of that fact. She had spent the past month making preparations in secret, securing passage on a steamship bound for New York, liquidating the small inheritance from her mother into portable funds, corresponding with a distant maternal relation who had offered her accommodation upon arrival in America. Eleanor had told no one of her plans to leave the suffocating confines of the Blackwood estate, not even Thomas, whom she trusted more than anyone. Some burdens were too heavy to share, some knowledge too dangerous to speak aloud. "Margaret promises many things," Thomas scoffed, interrupting Eleanor's thoughts. "Remember when she promised to help with grandmother's birthday celebration and then disappeared to London for a week? Left you to manage everything, including grandmother's notorious displeasure. I still remember the shade of purple the old dragon turned when she realized Margaret had fled." He chuckled at the memory. "I thought she might actually breathe fire." "She had her reasons," Eleanor said softly, defending her absent cousin, though she had often wondered about Margaret's sudden departures and unexplained absences. Margaret, with her sophisticated airs and London connections, had always been something of an enigma to Eleanor. There had been a time, when they were children, when the 2 female cousins had been inseparable, sharing secrets, dolls, and dreams of the future. But as they grew older, Margaret had pulled away, drawn to the glittering allure of society, while Eleanor remained rooted in the quieter pleasures of country life. Now, at 28, Margaret returned to the estate only for obligatory family gatherings, her conversation filled with names and places that meant nothing to those who had remained behind. "I'm sure she had marvelous reasons that made perfect sense to her," Thomas said dryly. "Margaret always does. The world revolves around her desires, does it not?" He plucked a blade of grass and twirled it between his fingers. "At least she deigns to correspond with you. I haven't received so much as a note from her in months, despite sending several letters describing my adventures in Greece. I thought at least the stories of the ruins would interest her, given her pretensions to cultural refinement." Eleanor busied herself with arranging the cutlery, taking care to match each piece with the correct plate. "Perhaps your letters went astray?" she suggested diplomatically. "The foreign postal services can be unreliable. You've said so yourself." "Perhaps," Thomas conceded, though his tone suggested he believed otherwise. "Or perhaps our cousin has simply moved beyond caring about family connections now that she has entree into the hallowed circles of London's elite." He sat up straighter, eyes narrowing as he looked toward the edge of the field. "Speaking of family connections, or lack thereof, will our esteemed oldest cousin honor us with his company today, or is he too preoccupied with his mysterious experiments to spare a few hours for mere mortal relations?" As if summoned by the mention of his name, a figure appeared at the edge of the field. William Blackwood moved with the deliberate slowness of a man who measured each step, his tall frame silhouetted against the golden backdrop of a distant wheat field. At 31, he was the eldest of the cousins, and many would say, the most peculiar. There had always been something different about William, a remoteness, a sense that he occupied a world adjacent to but separate from the one in which others lived. As a child, he had preferred the company of books to playmates, spending hours in the estate's vast library poring over ancient tomes while his cousins played hide-and-seek in the gardens. As a young man, he had attended Cambridge, where his brilliant mind had drawn the attention of prominent scientists and philosophers. But after 2 years, he had abruptly abandoned his formal education and returned to the Blackwood estate, converting the East Wing's old nursery into a laboratory where he pursued his own research, the nature of which remained obscure even to his closest relations. William's tall frame moved with deliberate slowness toward the picnic site, his posture rigid beneath his perfectly tailored black suit. Despite the warmth of the day, he wore a high collar and a hat that cast shadows across his pale face, giving him the appearance of a figure from another era, or perhaps another realm altogether. His features, which might have been called handsome in a classical sense, were rendered severe by his perpetual expression of detached observation, as if he were constantly cataloging and analyzing the world around him rather than participating in it. "Thomas, Eleanor." William's voice was deep and measured as he approached, each word enunciated with precision, as if English were a foreign language he had mastered through study rather than as his mother tongue. "A fine day for a gathering." Eleanor smiled up at him, shielding her eyes from the sun with one gloved hand. Despite the unease that William often inspired in her, an unease that had grown significantly in recent months as she observed changes in his behavior that troubled her deeply, she had always made an effort to bridge the gulf that separated him from the rest of the family. "William, I'm so pleased you could join us. I was worried your work might keep you away." William's lips twitched in what might have been an attempt at a smile or merely a facial tic. It was difficult to tell with him. "My work is never truly finished, dear cousin, but some occasions demand one's presence." His gaze swept over the picnic arrangement, taking in every detail with scientific precision. "You've gone to considerable trouble." "Not at all," Eleanor replied, though in truth she had spent hours planning every aspect of this final gathering. "It's a perfect day for dining al fresco, and it's been too long since we were all together." William settled himself on the blanket, movements precise, almost mechanical, arranging his long limbs in a way that maintained maximum distance from both Eleanor and Thomas while still being part of the group. From his coat, he produced a small wooden box, approximately 6 inches square, which he placed beside him without explanation. The box appeared old, its wood darkened with age and use, and bore no visible markings or decorations save for a small metal clasp that kept it secured. Thomas eyed the box curiously, but knew better than to ask. William's secretiveness about his scientific endeavors was legendary within the family. Some said he had studied with Tesla during his time in America. Others whispered of experiments too controversial for Cambridge, where he had briefly held a position before returning to the family estate. The servants spoke in hushed tones of strange noises emanating from his laboratory at night, of unusual deliveries that arrived under cover of darkness, of animals found dead on the estate grounds with no visible cause. Eleanor had dismissed such tales as superstitious gossip, until 3 months ago, when she had accidentally discovered the hidden compartment in the library that contained the Blackwood family records dating back to the 16th century. What she had read there had changed everything, setting in motion her plans to leave England forever. "I've brought that claret you mentioned enjoying last Christmas," Thomas said to William, attempting to bridge the awkward silence that had fallen. He held up the wine bottle, though I fear it may have warmed somewhat on the walk from the house. I rarely indulge in alcohol, William replied, his gaze drifting to the middle distance. It dulls the senses and impedes clear thought. However, I appreciate the consideration. This last statement seemed added as an afterthought, a concession to social norms that William understood intellectually but did not feel. Thomas shrugged, uncorking the bottle anyway. More for Eleanor and me then. And Margaret, should she ever arrive. She will be here presently, William said with a certainty that drew both Eleanor's and Thomas's attention. Her carriage turned onto the estate road approximately 12 minutes ago. I've brought your favorite, Eleanor said to William, opening a container to reveal perfectly arranged cucumber sandwiches with the crusts meticulously removed. The bread was sliced thin enough to be almost transparent, the cucumber equally delicate, with just a whisper of butter and a sprinkle of fresh dill. And Cook prepared those lemon tarts you enjoyed at Christmas. William's gaze flickered briefly to the offered food. Most thoughtful, he replied, though his eyes remained distant, as if his mind were occupied with matters far removed from picnic fare. He made no move to take any of the sandwiches. You must eat something, Eleanor urged, a hint of genuine concern in her voice. You've grown thinner since spring. Indeed, William's always lean frame had taken on an almost gaunt quality in recent months, his cheekbones more pronounced, his hands more skeletal. The changes in his physical appearance had coincided with an intensification of his reclusiveness and strange behaviors that Eleanor had observed with growing alarm. My physical requirements are minimal, William said. The body is merely a vessel after all, a temporary housing for what truly matters. Thomas snorted softly at this pronouncement, pouring himself a generous glass of wine. How delightfully morbid of you, William. I can see why you're not invited to more social gatherings. William's expression remained unchanged by the jibe. Society holds little appeal when one has glimpsed what lies beyond its trivial concerns. And what does lie beyond, cousin? Thomas asked, his tone hovering between genuine curiosity and mockery. Do share with us ignorant mortals the great truths you've discovered in your laboratory. I promise we shall try to comprehend, despite our inferior intellects. Before William could respond, if indeed he intended to, the sound of hooves and carriage wheels announced the arrival of the final cousin. The conveyance that appeared at the edge of the field was not the Blackwood family carriage, but a hired coach from London, its polished exterior and matched gray horses speaking to the expense Margaret had gone to for her journey home. Margaret's entrance was, as always, dramatic and calculated for maximum effect. The carriage stopped at the edge of the field, and she emerged like an actress taking the stage, her deep burgundy dress a stark contrast to the pastoral setting, its bustle and complex drapery clearly the work of a French couturier rather than the local dressmaker that Eleanor patronized. At 28, Margaret was the acknowledged beauty of the family, with dark hair arranged in an elaborate style that surely took her lady's maid hours to perfect, and features that combined the best of both Blackwood lines. Her father's aristocratic nose and cheekbones, her mother's full lips and expressive eyes. Unlike Eleanor, who had inherited the fair coloring of their grandmother, Margaret possessed the classic Blackwood darkness, a trait she emphasized with her choice of rich, jewel-toned garments. "My dear cousins," she called, making her way toward them with a parasol twirling above her head, its lace edge casting dappled shadows across her face. Her voice carried the slightly affected accent of one who had deliberately shed the provincial tones of their upbringing in favor of the more refined cadence of London society. "What a charming tableau you make, like something from a sentimental painting. Family gathering under ancient oak. How utterly quaint." Thomas rose to greet her, affecting an exaggerated bow. "We feared you might not come, Margaret. London society must be bereft without your presence today." Margaret laughed, a sound like crystal glasses clinking together. "London will survive without me for one afternoon, though several gentlemen expressed quite dramatic disappointment when I mentioned my journey north." She extended her gloved hand to Thomas, who took it with brotherly familiarity rather than the gallant kiss she seemed to expect. "The season is over anyway, and most of the interesting people have retreated to their country estates or gone abroad. Though I confess, I am expected at Lady Harrington's soiree this evening, so I cannot linger over long." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You plan to return to London today? The last train leaves at 4. "I've arranged for the coach to wait," Margaret replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. "The driver is well compensated for his time." She allowed Thomas to help her settle on the blanket, arranging her skirts with practiced precision to display their expensive fabric and intricate embroidery to best advantage. "William, you look as cheerful as ever," Still trying to unlock the secrets of the universe in that gloomy laboratory of yours? William's gaze flickered to Margaret, then away, as if the mere sight of her vibrant presence was slightly painful to his eyes. The universe keeps its secrets from those unworthy of them. The subtle insult hung in the air. Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, her fingers clenching around the handle of her parasol. "How fortunate, then, that you deem yourself worthy," she replied, her tone deliberately light. "One shudders to think what might happen if the universe's secrets fell into undeserving hands." An uncomfortable silence fell, broken only when Eleanor began serving the food. "I've prepared all of our childhood favorites," she said brightly, her voice taking on the practiced cheerfulness of one accustomed to smoothing over family tensions. Cook helped, of course, but I insisted on making the blackberry jam myself from the berries that grow along the south wall. Do you remember how we used to pick them as children? Our fingers and lips stained purple all summer long. Well, and grandmother scolding us for ruining our clothes," Margaret added, momentarily softened by the memory. "Though she always had Cook make those blackberry tarts we loved, despite her complaints about the expense of replacing our stained pinafores." "The blackberry bushes were planted by great-grandfather Thaddeus," William observed unexpectedly. "Did you know that? He had them brought from Cornwall after his cousins drowned. The original plantings. The same genetic lineage, still bearing fruit after nearly a century." "How fascinating," Margaret said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "Trust William to inject a note of morbidity into a charming childhood recollection." "Simpler times," Thomas said with unexpected wistfulness, perhaps hoping to steer the conversation back to safer territory. He accepted a plate from Eleanor and raised his wine glass. "To the Blackwood cousins and simpler times, before William discovered morbidity, Margaret discovered London, and Eleanor discovered—" "What have you discovered, Eleanor? You're the only one of us who seems relatively unchanged by the passing years." Eleanor felt 3 pairs of eyes turned to her, Thomas's warm and teasing, Margaret's idly curious, William's unnervingly intent. "I've discovered that some things are worth preserving," she said carefully. "Traditions, memories, connections. They matter more than we sometimes realize." They all raised their glasses, even William, though he merely touched the wine to his lips rather than drinking. Thomas drained half his glass in one swallow, while Margaret sipped delicately, her little finger extended in a gesture she had certainly not learned at the Blackwood dinner table. Eleanor had arranged the picnic with meticulous care, attending to details that she knew would please each of her cousins, or at least what would have pleased them in the past. She wasn't entirely certain that she knew who they were anymore, these 3 people with whom she shared blood and childhood memories but whose adult lives had diverged so dramatically from her own. Each cousin had their own plate, fine Wedgwood china with the family crest emblazoned in gold and deep blue. Thomas's plate held cold sliced beef, pickles, and a generous helping of the spicy mustard he had developed a taste for during his continental travels. Margaret had cucumber sandwiches, deviled eggs with caviar, and strawberries with cream, sophisticated fare suitable for her London-refined palate. Eleanor's own plate contained a selection of cheeses from the estate dairy, apple slices, and a small pot of honey from the Blackwood hives. And then there was William's plate. At first glance it appeared ordinary enough, a helping of cold chicken, some bread and butter, a slice of pork pie. But Eleanor found her gaze repeatedly drawn to it throughout the meal, a sense of unease growing within her each time she looked. There was something wrong about William's plate, something she couldn't quite identify but that made her stomach tighten with inexplicable dread. The arrangement of the food items seemed deliberate, not the random placement that would result from casual serving. And the knife beside the plate, it wasn't from the family silver. It was older, cruder, with a bone handle yellowed with age. The conversation flowed as they ate, a strange mixture of reminiscence and carefully disguised tension. They spoke of childhood adventures, the time Thomas had fallen from the apple tree in the orchard and broken his arm, the amateur theatrical productions they had staged for their parents in the Great Hall, the treasure hunt grandmother had arranged for William's 10th birthday that had led them through every room of the sprawling manor house. They touched upon family scandals in distant branches of the Blackwood tree, second cousins who had married inappropriately, great aunts who had caused talk with their political opinions, distant relations who had squandered fortunes or made them unexpectedly. Carefully avoided were the tensions of the present. William's increasing reclusiveness, Margaret's rumored entanglements with married men in London, Thomas's aimlessness and suspected gambling debts, Eleanor's quiet withdrawal from the few social engagements that had once punctuated her life at the estate. Each cousin carried secrets that remained unspoken, creating a complex web of things known but unacknowledged between them. Thomas regaled them with stories from his recent travels to the continent, his natural gift for storytelling bringing to life the gondolas of Venice, the snow-capped peaks of Switzerland, the bohemian cafes of Paris. Margaret dropped names of aristocrats and artists she'd met in London, each mention calibrated to impress with her social connections while revealing little of substance about her actual life in the capital. Eleanor spoke of her plans to volunteer at the village school, teaching reading to the children of tenant farmers, though she made no mention of the fact that those plans would never materialize due to her imminent departure for America. William said little, his attention seemingly elsewhere, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket. "Will you not eat, William?" Eleanor finally asked, noticing that while the rest of them had nearly finished their meals, William had barely touched his food. He had moved pieces around, rearranged them slightly, but consumed almost nothing. His abstinence was not unusual. William had never possessed a hearty appetite, even as a child, but today it seemed pointed, deliberate, as if the food served a purpose other than nourishment. William's eyes met hers, and for a moment, Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the gentle breeze that rustled the oak leaves above them. His gaze held knowledge, terrible ancient knowledge that no human mind was meant to contain. In that instant, Eleanor was certain that William knew of her discovery in the library, of her plans to flee, of her growing understanding of the Blackwood family's true history. But how could he know? She had been so careful, so secretive. "I find my appetite diminished of late," William said, his voice carrying an undertone that only Eleanor seemed to detect. "A side effect of my work, perhaps." "Your mysterious work," Margaret said, leaning forward with exaggerated interest, the movement causing the afternoon sun to catch the garnets at her throat, making them gleam like drops of blood. "You know, William, there are the most fascinating rumors circulating about what exactly you do in that laboratory of yours. Lady Harrington's nephew claims you're attempting to communicate with the dead." Margaret's tone was lightly mocking, but Eleanor noticed a genuine curiosity in her cousin's eyes. Despite her affected disinterest in family matters, Margaret had always possessed a streak of superstition that her London sophistication had never quite erased. As children, she had been both terrified and thrilled by ghost stories, often leading expeditions to allegedly haunted corners of the estate in search of spectral phenomena. William's expression remained impassive, his long fingers idly tracing the pattern of the family crest on his plate. "People fear what they don't understand. They always have." "Is it fear, though?" Thomas interjected, tearing a piece of bread in half with unnecessary force. "Or simply reasonable concern when one's cousin converts half the East Wing into a forbidden zone, imports strange equipment and unknown substances, and conducts experiments at all hours. The servants talk, William. They say they hear voices from your laboratory when you're alone. They say animals disappear from the grounds and strange lights are seen in your windows at midnight." He leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "They say you've been seen in the family crypt, taking measurements and making sketches." Eleanor felt her breath catch. She had not heard this particular rumor, and it alarmed her deeply given what she now knew about the Blackwood family history. The crypt contained generations of ancestors, including great-grandfather Thaddeus and his 3 cousins, who had allegedly drowned in a boating accident. The family records Eleanor had discovered told a very different story about those deaths, a story that had sent her fleeing to the town solicitor to book passage to America. William's hand stilled on his plate, and for a brief moment, something like anger flashed across his face before the mask of indifference returned. "The servants should attend to their duties rather than spreading ignorant gossip. Is that why Uncle Frederick stopped funding your research?" Thomas asked bluntly, emboldened perhaps by the wine he had consumed. Because he didn't understand it, or because he understood it all too well? A muscle twitched in William's jaw, the only visible sign that Thomas's question had affected him. Uncle Frederick, their father's elder brother and the family patriarch, had been William's patron until 6 months ago, when he had abruptly withdrawn his financial support and forbidden William from publishing any of his research. The breach between them had been the subject of much speculation among the extended family and local society, but neither William nor Uncle Frederick had offered any explanation. "Uncle Frederick lacked vision," William said, each word clipped and precise. "As do most people. He could not see beyond the boundaries of conventional thought. beyond the narrow confines of what current science deems possible. His voice took on a quality that Eleanor found disturbing, a fervent intensity that bordered on zealotry. There are forces at work in the universe that modern minds have forgotten how to perceive, energies that flow through all living things, connections that transcend physical limitations, powers that the ancients understood, but that we, in our arrogance, have dismissed as superstition. Good heavens, you sound like one of those Theosophical Society pamphlets that Lady Worcester is always trying to press upon everyone, Margaret said with a tinkling laugh. Next you'll be claiming to commune with spirits from the astral plane. The spirit world is merely one aspect of a much larger reality, William replied, apparently missing or ignoring her mockery. Death is not an ending, but a transformation, a doorway rather than a wall. Eleanor's eyes were drawn once again to William's plate, and suddenly she realized what had been bothering her. The arrangement of the food. It wasn't random. The pieces of chicken, the bread, the slices of pork pie. They formed a pattern, a symbol of some kind, deliberately constructed. The pattern was familiar, though she couldn't immediately place it. Then recognition dawned, sending ice through her veins. It was the same symbol she had seen in the hidden family records, drawn beside the account of great-grandfather Thaddeus's ascension ritual in 1801. Her heart began to race. Was she imagining things? Had her discovery of the family's dark secrets made her paranoid? She studied William's face, looking for some sign that his food arrangement was deliberate, but his expression revealed nothing. Only his eyes, when they briefly met hers, contained a glint of something that might have been triumph or anticipation. "More wine, anyone?" she asked, her voice higher than usual. She reached for the bottle, accidentally knocking over the salt cellar. A cascade of white crystals spilled across the blanket and onto William's plate, disturbing the careful arrangement. William's hand shot out with startling speed, gripping Eleanor's wrist so tightly she gasped in pain. His fingers were like iron bands, their pressure almost crushing the delicate bones beneath her skin. What shocked her most was not the strength of his grip, but its temperature. William's hand was unnaturally cold, as if he had been holding it in ice water moments before. "Clumsy," he said, his voice eerily calm despite the strength of his grasp. "Always so clumsy, Eleanor." Thomas frowned, setting down his wine glass with a sharp click against the china plate. "William, you're hurting her." For a moment William seemed not to hear, his gaze fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her feel as if he were looking not at her but through her, at something beyond the physical world. Then awareness returned to his eyes, and he released her immediately, his face resuming its mask of indifference. "My apologies. I've grown protective of my work in all its forms." "Your work?" Margaret echoed, looking at the plate with new interest, her dark eyes narrowing as she studied the disturbed arrangement of food. Margaret had always been observant, particularly of anything unusual or potentially scandalous. "Don't tell me arranging cold chicken is now considered scientific breakthrough. The Royal Society will be positively agog." "There are patterns in all things," William said, using his knife, that strange bone-handled implement that was definitely not part of the Blackwood silver, to carefully rearrange the food on his plate, attempting to restore the symbol that the spilled salt had disrupted. "Most are too blind to see them." Eleanor rubbed her wrist, red marks visible where William's fingers had been. The pleasant atmosphere of the picnic had evaporated, replaced by a tension thick enough to cut with the silver knife that lay unused beside Eleanor's plate. That knife. She stared at William's unusual implement. Unlike the others, which were standard silver tableware from the Manor's collection, William's knife was different, older, with strange markings etched into the blade near the bone handle. It wasn't from the Blackwood household at all. With a jolt of recognition, Eleanor realized it matched the description of the ritual knife mentioned in the family records, the one Thaddeus had allegedly used in 1801. "What an unusual knife," she said, unable to stop herself. "I don't recognize it from the family silver." William's eyes narrowed slightly, the only indication that her observation had unsettled him. "Observant of you, Eleanor. It's an artifact I acquired during my research. Quite old, pre-Celtic possibly." "You're eating with an archaeological artifact?" Thomas laughed, the sound forced and slightly too loud in the tense atmosphere. "Rather excessive even for you, William. What next? Drinking tea from the Holy Grail?" "It serves its purpose," William replied enigmatically, his gaze returning to his plate where he continued to meticulously rearrange the food despite the interference of the salt. His long, pale fingers moved with the precision of a surgeon, placing each morsel with exact care. Margaret sighed dramatically. adjusting her position on the blanket and smoothing her skirts. "Must everything be shrouded in mystery with you, William? It's becoming tedious." She turned to Eleanor, clearly seeking to change the subject. "Did I mention I met that writer everyone's talking about? Bram Stoker. His new novel has all of London in a state of delicious terror. Vampires and blood rituals. All very fashionable horror." "How appropriate," William murmured, so quietly that only Eleanor heard him. The wooden box William had brought now drew Eleanor's attention. It sat beside him, innocuous, yet somehow threatening in its plainness. In the bright afternoon sunlight, she noticed a detail that had escaped her earlier observation. A dark stain on one corner, which might have been mistaken for the natural grain of the wood. But Eleanor knew better. It was blood. Dried, but unmistakably blood. Her mouth went dry as pieces began to fall into place. The arrangement on William's plate forming the ritual symbol from the family records. The ancient knife matching the description of Thaddeus's ritual blade. The wooden box stained with blood. William's intense interest in the family crypt. The reference to 1801 and the four-generation cycle. It was all connected to what she had discovered 3 months ago. The true history of the Blackwood family and the terrible price of their prominence and power. "Will you show us what's in your box, William?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. If she was right about William's intentions, confronting him directly might be dangerous, but she needed to know for certain. She needed her cousins to see the evidence as well, to understand the threat that William posed before it was too late. All eyes turned to the wooden container. William placed his hand on it almost protectively, his long fingers splayed across the lid as if to prevent it from opening of its own accord. For a brief moment, Eleanor thought she saw the wood pulse beneath his touch, as if something inside were alive and responding to his presence. "It's merely equipment," he said, his tone dismissive. "Nothing that would interest any of you. Now you've made us curious," Thomas said, reaching for it. "Let's have a look." William's hand clamped down on the box with surprising force, the tendons standing out on the back of his hand like cords. "I said no." The words emerged as a growl, lower and more guttural than William's usual precise diction. Thomas withdrew his hand, eyebrows raised. "Very well. Keep your secrets." But Eleanor could see that Thomas was unsettled by William's vehemence, his easy manner giving way to wariness. Margaret observed the exchange with sharp interest, her eyes flicking between William and the box. "Now I'm intrigued as well. What could you possibly be carrying that requires such fierce protection? Love letters? Forbidden books? The crown jewels?" She laughed at her own jest, but the sound held an edge of genuine curiosity mixed with apprehension. Eleanor felt sick. The beautiful day, the carefully planned picnic, the farewell she had intended it to be, all of it was unraveling. And worse, she now understood with growing clarity that William had come with his own purpose, one that had nothing to do with family sentiment or fond farewells. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with extreme care, "that we should pack up now. The day grows late." It was a transparent excuse. The sun was still high in the sky, the afternoon only half spent, but Eleanor could think of no other way to disrupt whatever William had planned without revealing what she knew. "Nonsense," Margaret protested, gesturing toward the sunlit field surrounding them. "The sun is still high, and I've not yet told you about the scandalous affair between Lord Pembroke and his wife's lady's maid. It's been the talk of London for weeks. Apparently, they were discovered in the conservatory during Lady Pembroke's annual spring ball, in a state of, well," she dropped her voice to a theatrical whisper. "Suffice it to say that the poor lady's maid was dismissed without a character, and Lord Pembroke has retreated to his hunting lodge in Scotland for his health." She made quotation marks in the air with her fingers, smiling with the slightly malicious pleasure of one who enjoys others' misfortunes when they make for entertaining gossip. But Eleanor was already gathering plates, her movements jerky and panicked, silverware clattering against china as her trembling hands struggled to stack them properly. She needed to get her cousins away from this place, away from William and whatever ritual he was attempting to enact. In the hidden family records, she had read of the gathering beneath the ancient oak that had preceded the deaths of Thaddeus's 3 cousins. History was repeating itself, exactly as the records had warned it would, in a cycle that renewed itself every 4th generation. As she reached for William's plate, his hand caught hers again, this time more gently but no less insistent. His flesh was still unnaturally cold despite the warmth of the day. "Leave it," he said, his eyes boring into hers. There was something different about them now, a subtle change in their color, perhaps, or in the quality of light they reflected. They seemed darker, deeper, as if they opened onto infinite space rather than being merely organs of sight. "It's not yet finished." A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek, tracking a warm path through the coolness left by the afternoon breeze. "What have you done, William?" William's expression softened, perhaps the most genuine emotion he had shown all day. There was something almost like tenderness in his gaze, the look of a parent who must cause a child pain for their own good. "What was necessary, Eleanor? Always what was necessary." Thomas and Margaret exchanged confused glances, the easy camaraderie of their childhood temporarily reasserting itself in the face of this strange exchange between their cousins. "What are you two talking about?" Thomas demanded, setting down his wine glass with enough force that the remaining liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the white tablecloth with a spreading crimson mark, like an opening wound. "Eleanor, you're pale as a ghost. And William, you're making even less sense than usual, which is saying something." Margaret leaned forward, her curiosity overtaking her affected disinterest. "Is this some sort of private joke? Or have you two been keeping secrets from your dearest cousins?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing of the silent communication passing between Eleanor and William. Eleanor couldn't speak. Her throat had closed with terror as the full realization of William's intentions dawned on her. The arrangement on his plate wasn't just a symbol, it was a ritual, and the knife wasn't merely an archaeological curiosity, it was a ceremonial tool. The wooden box wasn't simply laboratory equipment. It contained everything needed to complete what great-grandfather Thaddeus had begun in 1801. "Perhaps," William said, reaching for the wooden box, "it's time I shared my work with the family after all." His voice had taken on a new quality, a resonance that seemed to vibrate in Eleanor's bones rather than merely reaching her ears. "You've all expressed such curiosity. It would be ungenerous to keep my discoveries to myself any longer." "William, no," Eleanor whispered, the words barely audible. She wanted to scream, to warn Thomas and Margaret of the danger, but fear had paralyzed her vocal cords as surely as if William had physically grasped her throat. But William was already opening the box, his long fingers working the simple metal clasp with ceremonial slowness. The lid raised with a soft creak of aged hinges, revealing its contents. A collection of small glass vials containing liquids of various colors, amber, deep red, clear blue, and one that seemed to shift between hues as the light struck it. Beside these was a bundle of dried herbs tied with black thread, their scent sharp and unfamiliar to Eleanor despite her extensive knowledge of the estate gardens. A tarnished silver bell lay nestled among these items, its surface engraved with symbols similar to those on William's knife. And at the center, dominating the arrangement, was a daguerreotype photograph of the four cousins as children, their faces scratched out with what appeared to be deep, violent gouges, with the exception of William's, which remained intact and eerily staring out from the damaged image. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "What on earth?" "That's us," Thomas said, leaning forward to peer at the photograph. "From Grandmother's 75th birthday celebration. I remember that day. Father gave me that pocket watch I'm holding in the image." His brow furrowed as he processed the scratched-out faces. "William, what have you done to this photograph? Why would you deface a family memento in such a manner?" "Science and superstition are not as far removed as modern thinkers would have us believe," William said, his voice taking on the cadence of a lecture, the familiar rhythm of a professor addressing students. It was a tone he had often used when explaining complex concepts to his cousins during their childhood education, a tone that had once made Eleanor feel safe and valued for her intelligence. Now it filled her with dread. "The ancients understood forces we have forgotten, forces I have rediscovered through years of research, through study of texts that the so-called enlightened minds of our age have dismissed as folklore or religious nonsense." He lifted one of the vials, the one containing the shifting, iridescent liquid, and held it up to the light. Within the glass, the substance seemed almost alive, moving in ways that defied the gentle motion of William's hand. Modern science recognizes matter and energy as the fundamental components of reality. But there is a third element, one that connects all living things, that flows through bloodlines and binds families across generations. The Egyptians called it Ka, the Chinese Ki, the Hindus Prana, the Blackwood family records. Here his eyes flicked to Eleanor, confirming her worst fears about his knowledge of her discovery. Refer to it simply as the essence. Thomas stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger and perhaps a touch of fear. "I think this picnic is over. Eleanor, Margaret, we're leaving. William can remain here with his essence and his mutilated photographs." He extended a hand to help Margaret rise, but as she placed her fingers in his palm, William spoke again, his tone unchanged but carrying a new authority that froze them in place. "No one is leaving," William said calmly. "Not until the ritual is complete." The air seemed to thicken around them, taking on an almost gelatinous quality that made movement difficult. Eleanor noticed with horror that the shadows cast by the oak tree had shifted, though the sun's position hadn't changed. The shadows now pointed inward, toward the picnic blanket, toward William's plate with its disturbed but still recognizable ritual arrangement. A strange silence had fallen over the field. The birds that had been singing in the hedgerows were quiet. The distant sounds of the estate, workers in the fields, horses in the stables, the occasional bark of a farm dog, all had ceased, as if the normal world had been suspended, leaving only the four cousins in a bubble of altered reality. "What ritual?" Margaret asked, her voice higher than usual. She remained half-risen, caught between sitting and standing, Thomas's hand still supporting hers. Her usual poise had deserted her, replaced by the wide-eyed fear of a child. "William, this isn't amusing." "It was never meant to be amusing, Margaret. Death rarely is." The word hung in the air between them. Death. Eleanor had known from the moment she recognized the symbol on William's plate what his intentions were, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that her suspicions had not. Eleanor lunged for the box, intending to knock it from William's hands, to disrupt whatever power it contained before he could unleash it fully. But she was too slow, or perhaps the thickened air itself impeded her movement. William had already removed the tarnished bell from the box and rung it once, its sound unnaturally loud and lingering in the still air, a perfect note that seemed to resonate within Eleanor's skull rather than in the atmosphere around them. "Do you know why I chose you three?" William asked, looking at each of his cousins in turn. His gaze was different now, no longer remote and analytical but fevered, intense, burning with a fanatical light that transformed his aristocratic features into something almost unrecognizable as human. "It's not personal, you understand. I bear none of you any ill will, quite the contrary. In a different world, under different circumstances, we might have continued as we were. Occasional family gatherings, perfunctory exchanges of letters, the slow drift into separate lives that is the common fate of childhood companions." He paused, removing the shifting-colored vial from the box and uncorking it with a small pop. A scent filled the air, not unpleasant but utterly alien, like no perfume or chemical Eleanor had ever encountered. It reminded her, strangely, of the moment before a lightning strike, a metallic tang that presaged imminent energy. "But we are Blackwoods," William continued, "and with that name comes responsibility, duty, a legacy that transcends individual desires or conventional morality." He poured 3 drops of the iridescent liquid onto his plate, where they sizzled slightly upon contact with the ritual arrangement of food. "Family is power, blood is power, and the blood of those closest to you, that is the greatest power of all." "You're mad," Thomas said, but there was fear in his voice now, a tremor that betrayed his understanding that they faced something beyond his experience or comprehension. His hand had tightened on Margaret's, no longer merely supporting her but clinging to her, as if human connection might protect them from whatever William had unleashed. "Visionary," William corrected. "There's often little difference. History judges harshly those who see beyond their time, only to venerate them once the world catches up to their understanding." Eleanor's mind raced. The food on William's plate, the ritual arrangement, the ceremonial knife, the box of arcane implements, and most chillingly, the photograph with their faces scratched out, a physical manifestation of William's intent to erase them from existence. It all aligned with what she had read in the hidden family records, the rituals performed by certain Blackwood patriarchs throughout the generations, always involving the sacrifice of family members, always resulting in enhanced power and fortune for the survivor. "You've poisoned us," she whispered, the realization dawning as she felt a strange heaviness spreading through her limbs. The food. It must have been the food, but she couldn't remember William having access to the kitchen, to the picnic preparations. She had overseen everything herself, had prepared many of the items with her own hands. William smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his austere features into something almost boyish, a glimpse of the curious, bright-eyed child he had once been before whatever darkness had taken root in his soul. "No, Eleanor. That would be crude and unpredictable. What I've done is far more elegant." He picked up the knife from his plate and held it to the light. The strange markings etched into the blade seemed to shift and move as the sunlight played across them, forming patterns that made Eleanor's eyes ache when she tried to focus on them. "The instrument matters," William explained, as if conducting one of the impromptu science lessons he had often given his younger cousins in their childhood. "This blade has been in the family since before we were Blackwoods, before we came to this land. It has witnessed every ritual, absorbed the essence of every sacrifice." Margaret had begun to cry silently, mascara leaving black trails down her cheeks like mourning veils. Thomas stood frozen beside her, as if movement might trigger whatever horror William had planned. Only Eleanor remained somewhat clear-headed, her terror focusing her mind rather than paralyzing it, forcing her to search desperately for some way to stop what was unfolding. "The Blackwood family has always had a special destiny," William continued, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality that reminded Eleanor of the prayers recited in the village church, familiar cadences for invoking higher powers. "Our ancestors knew it. They made pacts and sacrifices to ensure our bloodline's power. But over generations, the knowledge was lost, the rituals forgotten, performed imperfectly or abandoned entirely." His eyes gleamed with fervor. "Until I found the records hidden in the East Wing, in a compartment behind the family portrait gallery. Until I translated the texts and understood what needed to be done." Eleanor felt a chill at his words. She had discovered the same hidden compartment 3 months ago, had read the same records, but had reacted with horror rather than fascination. Where she had seen evidence of an evil that had corrupted her family for generations, William had found inspiration, a roadmap for his own terrible ambitions. "You found great-grandfather Thaddeus's journal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the black book with the family crest embossed in silver. William's eyes widened slightly, perhaps the only genuine surprise he had shown all day. "You know of it. I should have guessed. The fourth gift. The texts mentioned it." He studied her with new interest. "When did you find it?" 3 months ago. I was looking for a book in the portrait gallery and noticed the inconsistency in the paneling." Eleanor saw no reason to hide her knowledge now. Perhaps if she kept William talking, she could find some opportunity to disrupt his plans, to save Thomas and Margaret, even if she couldn't save herself. Margaret had stopped crying, her terror giving way to confusion. "What are you two talking about? What records? What gift?" Her voice had taken on a shrill quality that Eleanor had never heard before, the polished society accent cracking under the pressure of fear. "The cycle requires renewal every 4th generation," William said, ignoring Margaret's questions and addressing Eleanor as if they were the only two present. "A sacrifice of 3 to empower the one. The last time was in 1801, when great-grandfather Thaddeus emerged as the sole survivor of a tragic boating accident that claimed his 3 cousins. His emphasis on the word accident made it clear that the official family history was a fabrication. Eleanor had read the truth in Thaddeus's journal, how he had lured his cousins onto the lake, how he had performed the ritual beneath a full moon, how he had returned alone claiming that the boat had capsized, and only he had managed to swim to shore. Eleanor's mind flashed to the family portrait gallery, to the imposing painting of great-grandfather Thaddeus that dominated the main staircase, his cold eyes so similar to William's. The resemblance had always been remarked upon, but now it seemed more significant, as if some essence of Thaddeus had been reborn in William, some darkness passed down through the bloodline. "You can't believe this superstitious nonsense," Thomas said, finding his voice at last. His tone was equal parts disbelief and desperation. "This is the modern age, William. The century is almost over. We have electricity, automobiles, the telephone, all pale imitations of the power I seek." William interrupted. "Science without vision is merely tinkering. What good is an electric light compared to the ability to bend reality to one's will? What use is a telephone when one can communicate directly with the spirit realm? What value has an automobile when one can transcend the physical limitations of the body entirely?" He turned to Eleanor, his expression almost tender. "You suspected, didn't you? That's why you arranged this picnic. One last gathering before you plan to leave for America." Eleanor felt her breath catch. How could he have known? She had told no one of her plans to escape the suffocating confines of the Blackwood estate. to start anew across the ocean. The tickets were hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, the correspondence with her distant relation locked in her jewelry box. Your preparations were meticulous, William continued, answering her unspoken question. But you underestimated my resources. I've been watching all of you for months, tracking your movements, reading your correspondence, studying your habits and routines. I needed to understand the vessels before the ritual. Vessels? Thomas echoed, his face pale. Is that how you see us? Not as family, but as containers for whatever power you think you're harvesting? William's gaze shifted to Thomas, and there was something like pity in his eyes. You always were the least perceptive, Thomas. So caught up in your travels and adventures, so determined to escape the legacy of the Blackwood name rather than embracing its potential. Did you never wonder why your restlessness increased the closer you came to your 25th birthday? Why the dreams began? Dreams of drowning, of being pulled beneath dark waters by unseen hands. The blood remembers, Thomas, even when the conscious mind forgets. Thomas's expression revealed that William's words had struck home. Eleanor recalled how Thomas had returned from his European travels complaining of insomnia, of nightmares that left him drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. At the time, she had attributed it to the excesses of his travels. Too much wine, too many late nights in questionable establishments. Now she understood it had been something else entirely, some subconscious warning of the fate that awaited him, passed down through generations of Blackwood blood. The family records spoke of the fourth gift, William continued, turning back to Eleanor. The youngest always knows on some level, senses the danger. It's part of the pattern, a necessary component of the ritual. The fourth must be aware, must participate willingly or unwillingly. It's why you found the records when you did, why you understood them when others would have dismissed them as the ravings of a disturbed mind. You were meant to know, Eleanor, just as I was meant to perform the ritual. William's certainty was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire situation. There was no hesitation in him, no doubt, no moral qualm about what he intended to do to his own flesh and blood. In his mind, he was merely fulfilling a predestined role, continuing a tradition that had sustained the Blackwood family's power for generations. Eleanor's hands trembled. Stop this, William. Please. Whatever you believe, whatever you think you need to do, we can find another way. We're family. We've shared everything. Childhood, loss, this home. Does that mean nothing to you? For a moment, something like genuine regret flickered across William's features. It means everything, Eleanor. That's why it must be you three. The ritual requires the closest blood. Distant relations won't suffice. It must be those with whom the connection is strongest. He looked at each of them in turn. Believe me when I say I take no pleasure in this necessity. But the advancement of knowledge, the powers that will be unleashed, they will benefit all of humanity, not just the Blackwood line. How noble of you, Margaret said bitterly, finding a shadow of her usual caustic wit despite her fear. Sacrificing us for the greater good. I'm sure that will be a great comfort as we die. You misunderstand, William said. Death is merely a transition. Your essence will continue, through me. We will be united in a way more profound than any earthly connection. William shook his head, a gesture somehow both gentle and implacable. There is no other way. The ritual has already begun. He gestured to his plate, where the careful arrangement of food had been disturbed by the spilled salt. Although your clumsiness nearly disrupted the first phase, it's fortunate that I was able to restore enough of the pattern to proceed. Margaret suddenly stood, gathering her skirts in clenched fists, her face a mask of determination beneath the tear-stained makeup. I'm leaving. This is absurd. I won't sit here and listen to this lunacy. William clearly needs medical attention, and I intend to summon it immediately. She turned to Thomas and Eleanor. Are you coming, or do you plan to humor his delusions further? She managed 3 steps before collapsing to her knees, her breath coming in sharp gasps, the burgundy fabric of her dress pooling around her like a spreading bloodstain against the green grass. One gloved hand clutched at her throat, the other splayed against the ground as if to prevent herself from falling completely. Margaret! Eleanor cried, rushing to her cousin's side, all thoughts of her own safety forgotten in her concern. Margaret clutched at Eleanor's hand, eyes wide with panic. Can't breathe. Each word emerged as a painful wheeze, her chest rising and falling in a desperate attempt to draw air into lungs that seemed suddenly unwilling to function properly. Eleanor turned to William, fury replacing fear. What have you done to her? William observed the scene with clinical detachment. making a small notation in the leather notebook he had withdrawn from his pocket. The bell marks the beginning. Once rung, no one leaves the ritual circle. He gestured to the ground around them, and Eleanor saw with horror that a faint line had appeared in the grass, encircling their picnic blanket, a perfect circle that hadn't been there before. Thomas launched himself at William, his face contorted with rage and fear, all gentlemanly restraint abandoned in the face of Margaret's suffering. "You devil! What have you done to her?" His hands formed into fists as he charged across the picnic blanket, intent on physical violence that seemed woefully inadequate against the supernatural forces William had unleashed. But before he could reach his cousin, Thomas too crumpled to the ground, his body convulsing as if seized by an invisible electrical current, his back arched unnaturally, his limbs jerking in spasmodic movements that seemed to correspond to the soft humming now emanating from William's wooden box. A cry of pain escaped him, quickly cut off as his jaw clenched tight enough that Eleanor feared he might break his own teeth. "Thomas!" Eleanor screamed, torn between her two suffering cousins. She knelt beside Thomas, trying to cushion his head to prevent injury as his convulsions continued, while keeping one hand on Margaret's shoulder. Her mind raced, searching for anything in her limited medical knowledge that might help them, but she knew instinctively that this was no natural malady, no condition that could be treated with conventional remedies. William remained seated, unmoved by the chaos unfolding before him. He had arranged his long limbs in what Eleanor recognized as a meditation posture, his hands resting palm upward on his knees, his eyes half closed as he continued to chant softly in that strange ancient language. The ritual knife lay across his lap, its blade seeming to pulse with an inner light that matched the rhythm of Thomas's convulsions. "They won't die yet," William said conversationally, pausing in his chant to address Eleanor's unspoken fear. "The ritual requires specific timing. First comes paralysis, then the extraction, and finally the transference." He checked his pocket watch with the casual air of a man confirming the time for a social engagement. "We have approximately 12 minutes until the second phase." Eleanor cradled Margaret's head in her lap, her cousin's breathing now shallow but steady, her eyes open but unfocused, staring at the sky above with a terrible blankness that suggested her mind had retreated from the horror of her situation. Nearby, Thomas had stopped convulsing but lay rigid, only his eyes moving, filled with terror and fury in equal measure. A thin trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth where he had bitten his tongue during the seizure. "Why am I unaffected?" Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. If William had truly studied the family records as thoroughly as he claimed, if he understood the ritual that great-grandfather Thaddeus had performed, then Eleanor's role was predetermined, written in the pattern that had repeated itself throughout generations of Blackwoods. "The fourth gift," William repeated, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow but promising student. "The youngest is both witness and assistant." The texts were quite specific about that. "The fourth remains conscious, remains functional, while the others are prepared. You must help me complete the ritual, Eleanor. It's your role, your destiny, just as this is mine." Eleanor felt a cold determination replace her panic. If she was to be spared the initial effects, perhaps she could find a way to stop this madness before it progressed to William's second phase. She had read enough of the family records to understand the general outline of the ritual, but not the specific details that William had clearly mastered. There must be a vulnerability, a weak point in the process that she could exploit. "What must I do?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady, attempting to project a resignation and acceptance she did not feel. Perhaps if William believed she was cooperating, he would lower his guard, reveal something she could use against him. William smiled approvingly. "I knew you would understand your duty to the family." He reached into the wooden box and removed a small silver dagger, different from the knife on his plate. This one was newer, its blade gleaming in the afternoon sun, its handle wrapped in what appeared to be braided human hair of 3 different colors, black, chestnut, and blonde, representing Margaret, Thomas, and Eleanor herself. The sight of it made Eleanor's stomach turn. "When the time comes, you will make the first cut, just a small one, on the palm of each. The blood need only flow in drops, not rivers." He extended the dagger toward her, handle first. The braided hair seemed to writhe slightly against the silver, as if still living and responsive to Eleanor's proximity. "Take it. Feel its balance." The blade was forged from the same material as the ritual knife, but adapted for your hand specifically. Great-grandfather Thaddeus created it for his younger sister, who served as his fourth during the 1801 ritual. Eleanor took the dagger, her mind racing. The weight of it was strange, too heavy for its size, as if it contained some dense material at its core that defied normal physical properties. The handle felt warm against her palm, the braided hair seeming to tighten around her fingers like tiny serpents seeking purchase. What happened to her? Eleanor asked, thinking of the great-aunt she had never heard mentioned in family stories. After the ritual, what became of Thaddeus's sister? A shadow crossed William's face. The records are unclear. She disappears from the family history shortly after. I believe she may have traveled abroad. His evasiveness told Eleanor everything she needed to know. The fourth was expendable once their role was complete. Another victim of the Blackwood family's dark legacy. The silver dagger clutched in her hand, Eleanor saw her chance. William had returned his attention to the contents of his box, arranging the vials in a specific order according to some pattern only he understood. His guard was momentarily lowered, his focus diverted. With the dagger clutched in her hand, she lunged forward, aiming for William's throat, channeling all her horror and fear into a single, desperate strike that might end this nightmare before it claimed the lives of her cousins. But her arm stopped mid-strike, frozen as surely as if it had turned to stone. No matter how she strained, no matter how desperately she willed her muscles to complete the movement, her arm remained suspended in the air between them, the dagger's point just inches from William's exposed neck. It was as if she had suddenly been encased in invisible amber, preserving her in the moment of attack, but preventing its completion. William didn't even look up from his preparations. The texts mentioned that the fourth might resist. It's expected, even admirable. Now he did look at her, his eyes softening with what appeared to be genuine affection, like a parent regarding a child's futile rebellion. I don't blame you, Eleanor. You act out of ignorance, not malice. You don't yet understand the importance of what we're doing here, the significance it holds not just for our family, but for humanity's understanding of the spiritual realm. Eleanor found she could lower her arm, but any movement toward William with the dagger was impossible, as if she were pushing against an invisible barrier specifically calibrated to prevent violence against him. The dagger itself seemed to resist her intent, growing heavier in her hand until she could barely maintain her grip on it. "What have you done to me?" she whispered, a new terror replacing her earlier fear as she realized the extent to which she had been manipulated, prepared for this moment without her knowledge or consent. "Nothing that wasn't already written in your blood," William replied, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing a minor point of family history over tea, rather than in the midst of an arcane ritual. "The fourth cannot harm the one. It's a safeguard built into the ritual itself, established by our ancestors centuries ago when they first made the pact that secured the Blackwood fortunes. Your blood recognizes mine as its rightful master, just as the land recognizes its true owner, just as the spiritual realm acknowledges those worthy to pierce its veil." Eleanor dropped the dagger in despair, its silver blade glinting mockingly in the afternoon sun as it fell to the picnic blanket. If she couldn't attack William directly, she needed another strategy. Her eyes fell on the picnic basket, where a bottle of honeyed mead, Thomas's favorite, remained unopened. If she could somehow get William to drink it, perhaps the alcohol would dull whatever power he was wielding, create a momentary lapse in concentration that might disrupt the ritual. "I'm frightened, William," she said, injecting a tremor into her voice that wasn't entirely feigned. The situation was so far beyond anything she had ever experienced that genuine terror lay just beneath her thin veneer of calculated action. "If I am to assist you, might we have a drink first? To steady my nerves? I've never participated in anything like this before." William paused in his preparations, studying her face with the intensity of a scientist observing an unexpected reaction in an experiment. His eyes seemed to look through her surface thoughts, probing for deception. For a moment, Eleanor feared he could read her mind, that her desperate plan was as transparent to him as if she had spoken it aloud. But then he nodded, a small concession to what he perceived as her weakness. A sensible request. The ritual requires clarity of mind, but a small libation might help settle your fear. It's important that your hand be steady when you make the cuts. Eleanor reached for the picnic basket with shaking hands, retrieving the mead and 2 glasses. The bottle was heavy, its contents glowing amber in the afternoon light, a gift from one of Thomas's continental friends who specialized in ancient brewing methods. As she poured, she frantically tried to remember what else was in the basket. Cook had packed a small medicine kit at her request, smelling salts in case of ladylike vapors, bandages for potential walking injuries, and perhaps, yes, the laudanum tincture that grandmother had used for her neuralgia. If she could add enough drops to William's mead without his noticing, it might incapacitate him long enough for her to find a way to break the ritual circle and free her cousins. But William's attention was fixed on her every movement, his gaze tracking her hands with predatory focus. He accepted the glass she offered but did not drink immediately, instead holding it up to the light and studying the golden liquid as if it contained secret messages meant only for him. "Together," he suggested, raising his glass in a toast that felt like a grotesque parody of the earlier one Thomas had proposed. Eleanor had no choice but to raise her own. They drank, William's eyes never leaving hers over the rim of his glass. The mead was sweet on her tongue, honey and spices masking the potent alcohol beneath, but she barely tasted it, her mind consumed with finding another way to stop what was unfolding. William set down his glass and checked his pocket watch again, the gold case catching the sunlight and sending a brief, blinding reflection into Eleanor's eyes. 3 minutes until the second phase. We should prepare. He began moving the paralyzed bodies of Thomas and Margaret, arranging them in a specific configuration on the picnic blanket. The ritual required a precise geometric alignment, he explained as he worked, his voice taking on the dispassionate tone of a university lecturer. The human body was a conduit for spiritual energies, and proper positioning enhanced the flow of essence from vessel to receiver. It was all very scientific, he insisted, though the science existed beyond the understanding of conventional academia. Thomas's eyes followed William's movements with helpless rage as his body was manipulated like a tailor's dummy. Margaret had closed her eyes, perhaps seeking escape in unconsciousness, though the rapid fluttering of her eyelids suggested she remained terribly aware of everything happening to her. Their bodies were completely unresponsive to their wills, puppets with severed strings, yet their minds remained cruelly alert. "Help me with Thomas," William instructed, gesturing for Eleanor to take her cousin's shoulders. "He should be positioned to the north." "The male energy aligns with the northern cardinal point." Eleanor moved woodenly, supporting Thomas's shoulders as William dragged him to the designated spot. Thomas's eyes locked with hers, wide with desperation, and she tried to communicate with her gaze. "I'm trying. I won't let this happen. I won't abandon you." But what comfort could such silent promises offer in the face of the horror unfolding around them? Once both cousins were positioned to William's satisfaction, Thomas to the north, Margaret to the west, William directed Eleanor to sit at the eastern point of their grotesque compass. He himself took the southern position, with his plate and the wooden box in front of him. The arrangement placed them at the 4 points of a perfect square within the larger ritual circle, a pattern that Eleanor recognized from diagrams in the hidden family records. "The second phase requires a catalyst," William explained, as if delivering an academic lecture to eager students rather than explaining the mechanics of a ritual sacrifice to his intended victims. "A physical connection between all participants to facilitate the flow of essence." From the box, he withdrew a spool of red thread, so dark it appeared almost black in the shadow of the oak tree. The thread seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a small void in the visual field that made Eleanor's eyes ache when she tried to focus directly on it. This thread was spun from the wool of black sheep raised on Blackwood land, dyed with a mixture that includes the blood of each generation's ritual performer, William explained as he unwound a length from the spool. "Great-grandfather Thaddeus added his blood to the dye, as did his grandfather before him, and so on back through our lineage. I have added mine as well. The thread carries the essence of all who have performed the ritual, creating a continuity of power across generations." With methodical precision, he began to wind the thread around Thomas's wrist, murmuring words in that strange, ancient language as he worked. The thread seemed to sink slightly into Thomas's flesh, though it drew no blood and left no mark. From Thomas, William extended the thread to Margaret, creating a line between them that pulsed slightly in Eleanor's vision, as if it were a living vein carrying some dark fluid. He continued the thread to Eleanor, wrapping it 3 times around her left wrist before connecting it back to himself. The thread should have been slack between them, given the distance separating their bodies, but Eleanor observed with growing horror that it remained taut, as if pulled by an invisible force, and seemed to pulse with a subtle rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Where it touched her skin, she felt neither the softness of wool nor the dampness one might expect from a dyed material. Instead, it felt strangely metallic, conducting a warmth that spread up her arm like brandy flowing through her veins. "Blood calls to blood," William murmured, his eyes half closed in concentration as he completed the circuit, connecting the thread back to his own wrist with 7 precise turns. The thread is merely a symbol of what already connects us, a physical manifestation of the spiritual bonds that unite the Blackwood lineage across time and space. Eleanor felt a warmth spreading up her arm from where the thread touched her skin. It wasn't unpleasant, rather like the flush of drinking wine too quickly, but it terrified her nonetheless. The sensation seemed to bypass her physical senses, stimulating something deeper, more primal, a part of her being that she had never before been conscious of possessing. She was beginning to understand that William's power, whatever its source, was very real. Not some drug-induced hallucination or elaborate mechanism, but an actual manipulation of forces beyond conventional scientific understanding. "William," she said desperately, trying one last appeal to whatever remained of the cousin she had once known. The quiet, thoughtful boy who had taught her the constellations on summer nights, who had helped her identify butterflies in the garden, who had comforted her after their parents' deaths with awkward but sincere attempts at philosophical consolation. "Think of what you're doing. Thomas, Margaret, they're your family. Your blood, as you keep saying. How can you harm them? How can you reduce them to mere vessels for this essence you're trying to harvest?" Something flickered in William's eyes. A momentary hesitation, perhaps, or a shadow of the person he had once been, not yet fully subsumed by his obsession. "I don't do this out of malice, Eleanor. Their sacrifice will fuel the Blackwood legacy for another generation. Their essence will live on through me, through the power I will wield. They are not being destroyed but transformed, elevated to participate in something greater than their individual lives could ever achieve." His voice took on a dreamlike quality, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the physical world around them. "Imagine what I can accomplish with the combined life force of 3 Blackwoods flowing through my veins. The advancements, the discoveries. I will bridge the gap between science and spirituality, between the material and the metaphysical. I will commune with realms of existence that others can only speculate about. I will remake the world according to higher principles, guided by wisdom from beyond the veil that separates ordinary life from true reality." Eleanor realized with a chill that William truly believed in his cause, that he had rationalized his actions as necessary sacrifices for a greater good. This made him all the more dangerous. She couldn't appeal to his conscience or his love for family. In his mind, he was acting for the ultimate benefit of all, including those he was about to kill. The ends justified the means in the distorted moral calculus of his obsession. William began to chant in a language Eleanor didn't recognize. It sounded ancient, not Latin or Greek, which she had studied as part of her education, but something older, its syllables harsh and discordant, forcing the human vocal apparatus into patterns it was never designed to produce. As he chanted, the thread connecting them grew warmer, almost hot against her skin, and Eleanor felt a curious draining sensation, as if something essential was being pulled from her body through the connection, drawn inexorably toward William like water down a drain. Thomas and Margaret must have felt it too, for their paralyzed bodies began to twitch, and sounds of distress emerged from their frozen throats. Not quite screams, but strained, muffled noises that conveyed their suffering more effectively than articulate words could have done. Thomas's face had taken on a grayish pallor, while Margaret's skin seemed to be growing translucent, the blue veins beneath increasingly visible as whatever force William had unleashed continued to draw their essence from them. "Stop!" Eleanor cried, her voice thin and reedy against the building pressure in the air around them. "You're hurting them. William, please, this isn't you. This is something else, something that's taken hold of you. Fight it." William continued his chant, his voice rising in volume and intensity with each repetition of the strange phrases. The air around them seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from sun-baked stones, distorting Eleanor's vision and making the familiar landscape of the Blackwood estate waver like a reflection in troubled water. She felt lightheaded, struggling to remain upright as the draining sensation intensified, pulling not just at her physical energy, but at something deeper, something connected to her very sense of self. In desperation, she looked around for anything that might disrupt the ritual. Her gaze fell on William's plate, the arrangement that had been partially disturbed by the spilled salt, but that he had meticulously reconstructed. If it was as significant as William claimed, Perhaps destroying it completely would halt whatever was happening, break the pattern that channeled these terrible forces. The thread around her wrist made it difficult to move, seeming to anticipate her intentions and tightening painfully when she tried to shift position. But Eleanor was driven by more than her own survival instinct now. Thomas and Margaret were fading before her eyes, their life force being systematically drained to fuel William's twisted ambition. If she did nothing, they would die, and she would be complicit in their deaths, the unwilling fourth participant in a ritual that would irrevocably stain the Blackwood line with fresh blood. With the last of her strength, Eleanor lunged forward, breaking the invisible compass formation that William had so carefully constructed. The thread around her wrist pulled painfully tight, cutting into her skin deep enough to draw blood, but she ignored it, focused solely on reaching William's plate. The pain was clarifying, anchoring her to the physical world even as William's chanting seemed designed to separate consciousness from body. William's chant faltered as he realized what she was attempting. His eyes flew open, pupils dilated until only a thin ring of iris remained visible around the black centers. "Eleanor, no." The command in his voice was almost physical, a pressure against her body attempting to force her back into position. But she pushed through it, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her fingers closed around the edge of the plate just as a searing pain shot up her arm from the thread, as if it had transformed into a conduit for liquid fire. With a cry of defiance and agony, Eleanor hurled the plate against the trunk of the ancient oak tree. It flew from her hand with more force than she could have mustered under normal circumstances, as if her desperation had temporarily granted her supernatural strength. The plate shattered against the gnarled bark with a sound like a thunderclap, its fragments exploding outward in a spray of fine china and partially consumed food. But instead of falling to the ground, the pieces hung suspended in the air for a terrible moment, like a frozen explosion captured in a photograph, before a pulse of energy emanated from the point of impact, rippling outward through the ritual circle. The effect was immediate and violent. The taut thread snapped, its severed ends whipping through the air like angry serpents, leaving thin, bloody welts wherever they touched exposed skin. A sound like thunder cracked above them, though the sky remained clear. The ground beneath the picnic blanket trembled, and the circle that had contained them flared with brilliant light before vanishing, its outline scorched into the grass as if by a controlled lightning strike. William's face contorted with fury and disbelief. The calm, clinical demeanor that had characterized him throughout the ritual shattered like the plate, revealing beneath it a primal rage that transformed his features into something barely recognizable as human. "Do you realize what you've done?" he shouted over the unnatural wind that had begun to swirl around them, whipping at their clothes and hair, carrying with it a scent like ozone and copper. "The ritual cannot be stopped once begun. It can only be completed or what?" Eleanor demanded, cradling her injured wrist where the thread had cut deep enough to leave a perfect circle of beaded blood, like a macabre bracelet imprinted on her flesh. Despite her pain and exhaustion, she felt a surge of triumph at having disrupted whatever terrible process William had initiated. Thomas and Margaret were still alive. She could see the rise and fall of their chests, shallow but steady, and the oppressive atmosphere that had descended over the picnic site was dissipating, replaced by the normal sounds and scents of an English summer afternoon. William's expression shifted from anger to fear, a transformation so sudden and complete that it momentarily rendered him almost unrecognizable. Gone was the confident, controlled scientist priest who had commanded supernatural forces with casual authority. In his place stood a frightened man who realized too late that he had ventured beyond his depth into powers he could not fully control. "Or it turns upon the initiator," he whispered, the words barely audible above the unnatural wind that continued to circle them, now concentrating its force more directly on William himself, causing his carefully combed hair to whip around his face and his immaculate suit to flutter like crow's wings. As if in response to his words, the pieces of the shattered plate began to vibrate against the ground where they had fallen after the initial explosion. The fragments rose into the air, suspended as if by invisible strings, their jagged edges glinting in the afternoon sunlight. For a moment they hung there, a constellation of broken porcelain hovering at approximately the height of William's chest. Then, with the speed of bullets fired from an unseen gun, they flew toward William. He threw up his arms to protect himself, a futile, instinctive gesture against forces that operated beyond the realm of physical defense. The china shards tore into his flesh with unnatural precision, each finding vulnerable points despite his protective posture. The soft skin of his wrists, the exposed throat above his collar, the thin membrane of his eyelids. Dozens of small but deep wounds appeared in an instant, transforming William's pale skin into a grotesque canvas of red rivulets. William screamed, a sound of pure terror and agony that Eleanor knew would haunt her dreams for years to come. It was not the controlled, calculated cry of someone experiencing expected pain, but the primal shriek of a man confronting his own imminent obliteration, facing a horror beyond his capacity to comprehend despite his supposed mastery of arcane knowledge. The wooden box at William's feet burst open of its own accord, the careful arrangement of vials and implements within exploding outward with violent force. The glass containers shattered, their contents mixing in the air to form a noxious cloud that enveloped William like a shroud. The various liquids, amber, red, blue, and that strange iridescent substance, combined into a swirling mist that seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence, seeking entry to William's body through every available opening. His mouth as he screamed, his nostrils, the dozens of small wounds that now covered his skin, even the tear ducts of his wide, terrified eyes. Most horrifying of all, the ancient knife from his plate, the ceremonial blade that had been in the Blackwood family for generations, that had participated in ritual after ritual across the centuries, rose from where it had fallen, hovering before William at eye level. For one terrible moment it hung there, perfectly still despite the chaos surrounding it, its strange markings now glowing with an inner light that pulsed in rhythm with William's increasingly erratic heartbeat. Then, with a motion almost too fast for Eleanor to perceive, it plunged into William's chest with such force that he was knocked backward onto the ground, his body skidding several feet across the picnic blanket before coming to rest at the edge of the scorched circle. Eleanor watched in horror as William convulsed, his body racked by spasms that bent his spine at impossible angles. Blood bubbled from his lips with each desperate attempt to draw breath, staining his once immaculate white shirt with spreading crimson stains. His eyes remained open and aware, filled with the terrible knowledge of his own imminent death, silently pleading with Eleanor for a mercy she had no power to grant. The knife in his chest seemed to sink deeper with each of his weakening heartbeats, as if being drawn into his body by some unseen force, rather than merely penetrating it. Inch by inch it disappeared, the ornate bone handle growing shorter until it too began to sink beneath his skin, leaving only the strange markings briefly visible as they seemed to transfer themselves from the knife to William's flesh, forming patterns like living tattoos that writhed and shifted across his chest before fading into his increasingly pallid skin. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the supernatural violence ceased. The wind died, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. The hovering fragments of china that hadn't yet struck William dropped to the ground like marionettes whose strings had been cut. The noxious cloud dissipated, its acrid scent replaced by the normal summer fragrances of grass and wildflowers. The red thread that had bound them disintegrated into dust that was quickly carried away by a gentle natural breeze that seemed to cleanse the ritual site of the last vestiges of William's terrible magic. William lay still, his eyes open but vacant, the knife no longer visible, completely absorbed into his body, leaving only a small wound that leaked black fluid rather than blood. This substance, whatever it was, seemed almost alive, moving with purpose as it spread across his chest in intricate patterns that mimicked the symbols from his ritual plate before gradually being absorbed into his cooling flesh, leaving behind faint silver traceries like scars from wounds suffered in some ancient battle. Eleanor became aware of movement beside her. Thomas and Margaret were stirring, the paralysis apparently broken with William's death. The malevolent force that had held them immobile was gone, releasing them back to normal physical function, though the psychological scars of their experience would surely remain long after any physical effects had faded. Eleanor, Thomas's voice was weak but alert, his words slightly slurred as if he were emerging from a heavy dose of morphine. He struggled to sit up, his normally graceful movements now clumsy and uncoordinated. What happened? I couldn't move, couldn't speak. There was a pressure, like being underwater, and a pulling sensation. He reached toward his chest, hands splayed over his heart, as if to confirm it still beat within his ribcage. Margaret sat up shakily, her elegant hairstyle now in complete disarray, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her expensive burgundy dress torn and stained beyond repair. All her careful composure, her society mannerisms, had been stripped away by the experience, leaving her looking younger and more vulnerable than Eleanor had seen her since childhood. "William," she whispered, staring at their cousin's body with a combination of horror and disbelief. "Is he?" "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice hollow with the shock of all that had transpired. "He's gone." Thomas struggled to his feet, swaying slightly as if drunk or concussed. He looked around at the devastation of their picnic site, the scattered food, the shattered china, the scorched circle in the grass, the ominous dark stains on the blanket, before his gaze settled on William's body. "I remember." He was talking madness, about rituals and sacrifices and family legacies. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, wincing as his fingers encountered a tender spot on his scalp. Was it some kind of fit? A brain fever, perhaps? I've read that brilliant minds are sometimes susceptible to sudden mental collapse. Eleanor realized that Thomas and Margaret didn't fully remember what had happened, or perhaps their minds were protecting them from the impossible truth of it. They recalled fragments, impressions, sensations, but not the full horror of William's ritual or the supernatural retribution that had claimed him when Eleanor disrupted it. She wondered briefly if this partial amnesia was a mercy granted by whatever forces governed such matters, or simply the natural defense mechanism of minds confronted with realities they could not integrate into their understanding of the world. Either way, she decided in that moment that it was better that way. Better for them not to know the full extent of what William had attempted, not to understand how close they had come to being sacrificed for his terrible ambition, not to have to reconcile their scientific modern worldview with the ancient forces that had manifested beneath the oak tree. And better, perhaps, for them not to know of Eleanor's own part in it all, the fourth gift that had made her both participant and saboteur in William's ritual. "Yes," she said, seizing upon Thomas's rational explanation with relief. "William has been unwell for some time. His experiments affected his mind. Uncle Frederick must have recognized the symptoms, which would explain why he withdrew his funding. Today, William suffered some kind of attack that proved fatal." Thomas nodded slowly, accepting this interpretation with visible relief. It was a narrative that made sense within his understanding of the world, tragic but comprehensible, requiring no uncomfortable confrontation with forces beyond scientific explanation. Margaret had begun to sob, the reality of their cousin's death sinking in despite her fragmented memory of the events leading to it. "We should have seen it, should have known he was ill. Those long hours in the laboratory, his increasing isolation, his strange theories, all signs that his mind was fracturing under the strain of his work." Thomas moved to examine William's body, his natural curiosity and sense of responsibility overriding his lingering weakness. Eleanor stopped him with a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong given her own exhaustion. "Don't!" she warned, her voice low and urgent. The black fluid still seeping from the wound in William's chest was unlike anything she had ever seen. Not blood, not pus, not any natural substance produced by the human body. She had no idea what it might do to someone who touched it, and she had no desire to find out. "We don't know what chemicals he might have been working with. They could be dangerous." It was a plausible explanation for the strange substance, and for the acrid smell that still hung in the air, a lingering trace of the noxious cloud that had enveloped William in his final moments. Thomas nodded slowly, accepting her caution. "You're right. I've read of chemists poisoned by their own compounds. Victorian laboratories are hardly bastions of safety." He stepped back from William's body, his expression troubled. "I'll go to the house, send servants to help us bring him back." He hesitated. "And fetch the doctor, though it's too late for that. And inform Uncle Frederick," Margaret added, wiping at her tears with a handkerchief that was already sodden and filthy. "He should be told immediately, though I don't relish being the one to deliver the news. He and William may have quarreled, but he'll be devastated nonetheless." As Thomas walked away, still unsteady on his feet but determined to fulfill his self-appointed task, Margaret turned to Eleanor with confusion in her eyes. "I can't seem to remember exactly what happened," she admitted, her voice small and frightened, so different from her usual confident tones. "One moment we were having a picnic, and the next," she gestured helplessly. "It's all a blur, fragments that don't connect. I remember feeling as if I were being emptied somehow, drained. But that makes no sense." Eleanor took her cousin's hand, careful to avoid touching the place where the red thread had bound her. A faint mark remained there, a perfect circle around Margaret's wrist like a bracelet-shaped bruise, already fading but still visible to Eleanor's searching gaze. Thomas had a similar mark, she had noticed, though he seemed unaware of it. Eleanor's own wrist bore a deeper imprint, the circle broken where the thread had cut into her skin when she lunged for William's plate. "It's all right," she said gently. "It happened very quickly. William had some kind of seizure. It was distressing to witness. Our minds often protect us by blurring the details of traumatic events." The explanation sounded plausible and contained enough truth to satisfy Margaret without revealing the full horror of what had actually occurred. Margaret nodded, accepting this explanation with visible relief. Yes, that must be it. A seizure. Poor William. Despite her apparent distress, Eleanor detected a note of calculation entering Margaret's voice, the society woman in her already considering how this tragedy would be presented to her London circle. Such a brilliant mind, destroyed by his own dedication to scientific advancement. It's almost poetic, in a tragic way. Eleanor felt a flicker of disgust at Margaret's quick pivot to narrative crafting, but suppressed it. People coped with shock in different ways, and Margaret's retreat to social performance was as much a defense mechanism as Thomas's practical action, or Eleanor's own protectiveness. They were all in their ways, trying to process the unprocessable, to fit the events of the afternoon into frameworks they could understand and manage. In the distance, she could see Thomas approaching with several servants. Soon there would be explanations to give, arrangements to make, a story to craft that would make sense of the senseless, decisions about William's laboratory, his papers, his possessions, a funeral to arrange. And through it all, Eleanor would need to maintain the fiction that what had happened was merely a tragic medical episode, rather than an encounter with forces that had no place in the rational Victorian world her cousins inhabited. Margaret rose to meet the approaching servants, composing herself as best she could, ever conscious of appearances even in tragedy. The transformation was remarkable. Within moments, the vulnerable, confused woman of minutes ago was replaced by the poised society figure Eleanor was more familiar with. Margaret's back straightened, her chin lifted. Her voice assumed the authoritative tone of the lady of the house, giving direction to subordinates, though technically that position belonged to their aunt, Uncle Frederick's wife, who was currently visiting relatives in Bath. Eleanor remained seated, suddenly reluctant to move from the spot where their lives had changed forever. She felt drained, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually, as if the ritual had taken something from her, even as she had disrupted it. Perhaps it had. The fourth gift, William had called it. A special sensitivity that had allowed her to detect his plans, to resist his influence, to act when action was needed. But gifts often came with costs attached. She withdrew the china shard from her pocket and examined it in the late afternoon sunlight. A portion of the family crest was visible on its surface, the Blackwood tree and the Latin motto beneath it, Potentia in sanguine, power in blood. The fragment was larger than she remembered picking up, its edges no longer jagged but smooth, as if melted and reformed by some intense heat. And strangest of all, the pattern on it had shifted, showing not just a portion of the crest, but the entire design in miniature, perfectly rendered despite the shard's size. As Eleanor watched, a drop of blood from her wounded wrist fell onto the shard. Instead of staining the white china, the blood seemed to be absorbed into it, disappearing completely, without leaving even a trace of color behind. And in that moment, as the blood vanished into the fragment, Eleanor understood with perfect clarity what had happened. The ritual had been completed after all, not as William had intended, with his claiming the life force of his three cousins, but in another way, an older pattern perhaps, one documented in those hidden records but overlooked by William in his obsessive focus on power acquisition. The fourth had thwarted the one, redirecting the ritual's energies, and in doing so, had become the unintended recipient of whatever transfer William had initiated. 3 days later, Eleanor stood alone in William's laboratory, having finally worked up the courage to enter the forbidden space. The room was just as he had left it, apparatus gleaming on workbenches, books open to specific pages, notes scattered in his precise handwriting. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sunlight that streamed through the high windows, giving the laboratory an otherworldly quality, as if it existed partially in another dimension. She moved through the space with growing confidence, her initial trepidation giving way to curiosity, and then to something approaching familiarity. Each instrument, each experiment, each notation seemed to resonate with some new understanding that had been growing within her since the picnic. Knowledge that should have been foreign to her seemed to bubble up from some deep well within her mind. William's knowledge, she realized, with a mixture of horror and fascination. It had started with dreams the night after William's death, vivid visions of places she had never visited, people she had never met, experiments she had never conducted. At first, she had attributed them to the trauma of witnessing her cousin's death. But then had come the waking knowledge, an ability to read the Latin and Greek texts in William's laboratory without having studied those languages beyond a schoolgirl's basics, an understanding of chemical formulas that should have been meaningless to her, an intuitive grasp of the purpose behind each piece of equipment that littered the workbenches. On the central work table lay a leather-bound journal, open to the last entry William had made, dated the morning of the picnic. Eleanor read his words, written in his characteristically meticulous script, feeling as if she were eavesdropping on private thoughts while simultaneously recognizing them as familiar, almost as if she had written them herself. Today marks the culmination of my research. The ritual will be completed at precisely 3:17 p.m., when the oak's shadow aligns with the ancient stone boundary of the original Blackwood property. The preparations are complete, the thread dyed, the knife consecrated, the plate arranged according to the pattern described in Thaddeus's journal. All that remains is the gathering of the vessels and the performance of the chants. Eleanor suspects something, as the texts predicted she would. The fourth gift brings intuition, a connection to the older ways that the others lack. I've prepared for her resistance, though I admit some regret at the necessity of including her in the sacrifice. She has always been the most like me, curious, observant, unafraid to seek uncomfortable truths. In another circumstance, she might have been my apprentice, rather than my offering. But the ritual demands 3, and the bloodline provides no alternatives in this generation. If my calculations are correct, by sunset I will have absorbed the essence of all 3 cousins. The combined power should be sufficient to pierce the veil between worlds, allowing me to access knowledge that has been denied to mortals since the ancient pact was first formed. I will record my findings in subsequent entries, creating a record for future generations of Blackwoods to follow, building upon my work as I have built upon Thaddeus's. Eleanor's hands trembled as she turned the page, finding it blank. William had been so certain of his success that he hadn't considered the possibility of failure, or of what might happen if the ritual found a different vessel than the one he had intended. The arrogance was so characteristic of him that she could almost hear his voice reading the words aloud, confident and precise, utterly convinced of his own rightness. But there was something else in the entry that caught her attention, something she hadn't known before. The timing of the ritual hadn't been arbitrary, but carefully calculated to align with a specific astronomical and geographical configuration. And if that was true, what other aspects of William's ritual had been based on precise calibrations rather than mere superstition? The implications were disturbing, that what had occurred was not merely the delusion of a disturbed mind, but something rooted in observable, repeatable phenomena that simply fell outside current scientific understanding. She closed the journal and placed it in the satchel she had brought. Along with it, she packed several of the more unusual instruments from William's workbench and a selection of his notebooks that contained his most recent findings. The servants had been instructed not to enter the laboratory until she had sorted through Cousin William's personal effects, giving her ample time to take what she needed without arousing suspicion. What she needed. The phrase echoed in her mind with grim humor. Until 3 days ago, Eleanor had needed only passage to America and a fresh start, away from the suffocating weight of the Blackwood legacy. Her plans had been simple: to use her modest inheritance to establish herself in New York, perhaps as a teacher or companion to a wealthy family, to build a life free from the shadows that seemed to cling to the ancient stones of the Blackwood estate. Now her needs were different. The knowledge that had been William's was still fragmentary in her mind, coming in flashes and intuitive leaps rather than as a coherent whole. But it was growing stronger by the hour, integrating with her own thoughts until she could no longer clearly distinguish where her understanding ended and his began. Along with the knowledge came abilities, small ones so far, but unmistakable. Objects moving slightly when her emotions ran high, candles lighting without being touched. Dreams that showed events occurring elsewhere in the house confirmed the next morning. A heightened awareness of the natural world around her, as if she could sense the life force flowing through plants and animals, could feel the ancient energies that ran through the earth beneath the estate. The shard from William's plate, now wrapped in silk and nestled in a small wooden box identical to the one William had brought to the picnic, was proof of the transformation. It had changed over the past 3 days, the fragment of the family crest expanding until the entire emblem was visible on its surface, despite the shard being too small to contain it, a physical impossibility that Eleanor now accepted as merely the first of many she would encounter as her inherited powers grew. She finished packing the satchel and took one last look around the laboratory. Tomorrow she would still board the ship for America as she had planned, but her purpose in going had transformed. William's research had been limited by his resources, by the superstitions of rural England, by the boundaries of the old Blackwood property with its ley lines and ancient stones that influenced and sometimes constrained his workings. America offered new possibilities, new energies to tap, new boundaries to cross. A land of immense natural power, unconstrained by centuries of European magical workings that had channeled and domesticated the wild forces of the old world. In America, Eleanor suspected, the barriers between worlds might be thinner, more permeable, especially in places where ancient indigenous peoples had recognized and worked with the land's inherent energies. And unlike England, with its established esoteric societies and watchful practitioners who might recognize what she was becoming, America offered anonymity, a place where she could explore her newfound abilities without drawing unwanted attention. And Eleanor, no longer just Eleanor, but something more, something combined, would explore them all, would build on William's research while avoiding his fatal arrogance and hunger for personal power. She would approach the mysteries with caution and respect rather than entitlement, would seek understanding before control, knowledge before application. At least, that was what she told herself as she closed the laboratory door behind her, the key turning with a decisive click that seemed to mark the transition between her old life and whatever awaited her now. She left the laboratory, locking the door behind her and pocketing the key. Thomas and Margaret were in the drawing room, still subdued by William's death and their own fragmented memories of that day. The funeral had been yesterday, a small, restrained affair attended by Uncle Frederick and a handful of local gentry. William had been interred in the family crypt, his coffin placed alongside generations of Blackwoods, including great-grandfather Thaddeus and the 3 cousins whose deaths had fueled his ascension. Eleanor had stood at the graveside feeling the weight of history and heredity pressing down upon her, wondering if the cycle would ever truly be broken or merely continue to evil.